Um, so next we have Dr. Heather Zwickey. The list of accolades is so long. I know I'm going to miss many of them, so I'm going to do my best. Dr. Zwickey has a PhD in immunology and microbiology from the University of Colorado Health Science Center with a focus on infectious disease and vaccine development. She went on to get her postdoctoral fellowship and teach at Yale University School of Medicine, where she worked on immunotherapy for cancer. She was then recruited to the National University of Natural Medicine on the other coast, out in Portland, Oregon, where she launched the Healthcott Research Institute and served as its director for 17 years. In 2009, Dr. Zwickey established the School of Graduate Studies at NUNM, developing programs in integrative medicine, research, nutrition, and global health, among others. She served as the founding dean, or she is the founding dean of the graduate school, continues to teach many courses. She co-led the NIH-funded clinical research training program, the Bridge Building Research Across Interdisciplinary Gaps program, focusing on training the next generation of integrative medicine researchers. And I think the contributions that Dr. Zwickey has given to the next generation of researchers cannot be understated. I think I don't know a single person from NUNM who doesn't claim you as research mama in some shape or form, or teacher mama in some shape or form. Dr. Zwickey also teaches at other universities, speaks at conferences worldwide, and really has shifted research focus over to naturopathic medicine, really interested in the gut-brain axis and neuroinflammation. I could keep going. I will add that recognized internationally. I was most impressed when I went on PubMed to find out what publications Dr. Zwickey had published, and the first one that came up had her name in the title as kind of the grandmother of naturopathic research in medicine. And she also recently has taken a position at RAND Reach Across Complementary and Integrative Health Institutions, RAND Reach, as their associate director. There's so much that I'm leaving out, but please feel free to fill in the gaps. And I'm so grateful to have you here today.
Thanks, Brenna.
Yeah.
Um, Brenna and I met when she did the Bridge program. So that is our link, which is awfully exciting. I assume you can see my slides in a good format here.
Looks
And I'm just,
fantastic.
yeah, I'm going to talk about research and specifically about where to start when we start thinking about eating disorder research. This is a conversation that Brenna and I have had multiple times, and we're going to present it to you. So, first, I need to disclose, as you heard, I am a professor. I'm actually the Associate Vice President of Research and Academics at the National University of Natural Medicine. I sit on several scientific and wellness advisory boards, including Burt's Bees, Halion, Thana, and Attune Biotech. And I have funding from three different centers at NIH, two grants from the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, one from the National Center for Diabetes, Digestive Disease, and Kidney Disease, and then one on the National Institute of Aging. What we're going to talk about today is we're going to start with the landscape, then we're going to talk about types of studies, and then we're going to talk about eating disorders and psychedelics. So let's go ahead and get started with the landscape. Often, when we are thinking about doing a research project, it starts with some experience we have or an idea that we have. Once that little aha moment occurs, like maybe this would be a good topic for a research project, the first thing that we need to do is learn the landscape, the history, and the current state of the science. So I say this knowing that over the past 25 years, I've watched people get super excited about a project idea only to discover it's already been done. Or they get really excited about a project idea and then they can't figure out how to do it. So the first thing to do is just learn the landscape. Then we need to learn who is doing what and where they're doing it. And then our third step is to identify the gap that needs to be filled. So let's break this down a little bit. How are you going to learn the landscape? Well, I know people don't really like reading anymore, but you got to start by reading. You got to jump on PubMed and start reading papers. How many papers do you need to read? Well, usually what I say is you need to read until you can predict what the next paper will say. Now, usually that's around 20 to 30 papers in a particular subject area. But when you're at that place where you're like, oh, yeah, I know what this one's going to say, then you've read enough. And what kind of papers should you be reading? Usually, what you should do is you should start with reviews to start getting familiar with the terminology and getting familiar with, you know, how different projects have evolved. Once you're done with reviews and you can predict what the next review is going to say, then you jump into the clinical trials and you see what is the most recent research that people are doing. How do you track your research and your reading? I highly suggest that people adopt a reference manager. I use Zotero because it's free and it's in the cloud. So I can be working from home where I am today, or I can be working from my office or working from Santa Monica where I was earlier this week, or working from Maine where I was this last weekend. And I always have access to all of my references. I can read a paper and drop it into Zotero, and it's got a link for Chrome. So all you literally have to do is click the Chrome extension and it's added to your Zotero library. Now, the other way that you can track your reading is with a Pico. And you may or may not know what a Pico is. And I'm not referring to Pico de Gallo, although it was named for Pico de Gallo. Pico de Gallo Pico de Gallo. Pico for clinical studies is who are the participants? What is the intervention? What is the comparison group? And what is the outcome measure? So this isn't what are the results, it's what outcome are they measuring. In addition to Pico, I will often keep track of the journal, where was the study published, the author. The first and the last author are the ones who have the most say in what is in that manuscript. Typically, the first author is the person who wrote the study, and the last author is the person who got the study funded. So they often have the grant. And then the location, because it may matter where that study happened. Certainly, we know that when we're talking about eating disorders, the US companies are out of control. If the study is happening in Japan, it may be a very different conversation that we're having. All right, so as we learn who is doing what and where they're doing it, a Google search is where most people are going first. Just Google it. The problem is Google does not discriminate between a lot of different things. It's too coarse. Often there's not enough detail in the list, even if you're using Google Scholar, to know like was this study a seminal study in the field? Usually, what Google is going to do is they're going to bring up the most popular study, which means the media got a hold of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a study that's the best one for you to be reading. So I love Google, not saying don't Google things, just saying where you should probably start your search is with PubMed. And the cool thing with PubMed is it'll also give you author affiliations. I'm going to show you that in just a second. And then after PubMed, I go to NIH Reporter. So let's look at that. So in this case, my search term is binge eating disorder. And you can see that PubMed brought up a randomized controlled trial in the International Journal of Eating Disorders that took place in 2023. And when I said it shows you affiliations, right down here, if you click that little expand button, you can see where this particular study happened. And this particular study happened at Yale in the Department of Psychiatry. By the way, when I did this search, I didn't intend to bring up Yale. It just happened magically. So let's look at our author order. In this study, we would assume that Carlos had the most input into this study and that Ralitza is the person who got the funding. The next place that I have people look just to see what's happening in the world is a website that most people haven't been to, and it's called NIH Reporter. I've given you the website down below, so reporter.nih.gov. The cool thing about NIH Reporter is it allows you to search all of the grants that are funded in any particular area. If you look down here, the part that you can't see is each of these are the institutes that are doing the funding. And NIH currently has 28 active institutes. If you want to know who's got the most funding and the most funded projects, it's right here, and that's the National Cancer Institute. These little tiny bars here, that's where NCCIH is. So they don't get a whole lot of funding. If we repeat our search on binge eating disorder and I look at what comes up on NIH Reporter, you can see that I get grant numbers down the left. I get the people who are doing the research here. I've got the titles of each project, where they are located, and it even tells me how much funding each individual is getting for their research. So one of the things you'll notice is that a lot of the binge eating disorder research is being funded by the National Institutes on Mental Health. That's what NIMH is. We've got a couple of studies that are in other locations. So this is minority health down here. And if you look at the title of the grant, you see population-specific eating disorder risk in sexual minority women. And so that's why that grant is funded by the National Institute of Minority Health Research. There are some really interesting studies, by the way, and the numbers of the grants are going to look like an alphabet soup to those of you who are not familiar with NIH. The large grants are called RO1s. And so you'll see the first grant that came up here at North Dakota State is an RO1. And this grant down here, investigating the role of the nucleus accumbens delta in the loss of control, that is also an RO1 at Penn. F-31s, these are training grants. And so look at the amount of money that's here. It's a whole lot less than an RO1, where the average amount of money for an RO1 is around $500,000 a year. This one at North Dakota State must have gotten permission to go this high, because 669,000 is higher than what most RO1s will get you. Okay, so how do we then use this information to identify gaps? Well, we go through and we look at, for each of these things, who are our participants, what's the intervention, what's the comparison, and what outcome do we want to look at? So I want to just think this through as a group right now. And I want our outcome to be life purpose. The reason that I'm thinking about life purpose is that as you've listened to the talks on eating disorders, and I just listened to Nancy's talk, a lot of what people talk about is that feeling like they don't matter, like it doesn't matter that they belong, that they're anxious. And I feel like when we start trying to get at the underlying causes, yes, there's surely underlying causes with food, there's underlying causes with genetics, there's underlying causes with what we're exposed to. But I wonder how much of this idea of life purpose is an outcome. So as I think about this, I think about, well, have any studies been done on people with binge eating disorder, where life purpose is an outcome? So I'm going to start with PubMed and I'm going to do a search. So life purpose and eating disorders is my search. And when I do that, I see a few studies come up. In fact, this one, psychometric properties of the purpose and life test and age-related differences among women diagnosed with eating disorders, is a pretty exact match to what I asked for. Now, you'll notice the next study down, characterization, epidemiology, and trends of eating disorders. They might have mentioned life purpose here, but I also can see that the article is in Spanish. And unfortunately, I speak German, Russian, Portuguese, and Swahili, and I don't speak Spanish. So this isn't going to help me much. But here's another article, again, a review article. And if I'm wanting to get a feel for the field, review of the burden of eating disorders, mortality, disability, costs, quality of life, and family burden. So that might be another study that I'd want to look at. On the left-hand side here, you see that I could actually shorten the period of time. Maybe I don't want to look at any studies that are older than 10 years old. I can also only look for studies that are free full text. There's 65 pages of studies here. So clearly, I'm going to have to do some limitations. But let's go ahead and look at this psychometric properties study. So I've got the reference here on the left-hand side, but let's look at the PICO. So the PICO of this study is that participants were 250 Spanish women diagnosed with eating disorders who ranged from 12 to 60 years old. They gave no intervention, which means this is probably going to be a cross-sectional study or an observational study. Their control is what they were looking at. Who were they comparing? Well, they were analyzing the relationship between hopelessness, life purpose, and overweight preoccupation. The outcomes then included correlations between the purpose in life test and the Beck hopelessness scale. Yes, there actually is a hopelessness scale. That in and of itself, that we have to have a hopelessness scale, should make us all very sad. And then the overweight preoccupation scale. All right, let's look at the results. The results showed that the meaning in life is negatively related to common mental problems with people with eating disorders. The purpose in life test was adequate for measuring meaning in life in women diagnosed with eating disorders, and they discovered that meaning in life decreases with age. Well, that's a real bummer, I say, as I continue to grow older and have grandchildren. Um, but that's an important thing for us to know, is that people are losing purpose in life as they age. Now, if you're anything like me and you say, oh, people are losing purpose in life, I want to know what that test looks like. Now I can go to Google. And if I go to Google, I can find the purpose in life test. And here it is, the purpose in life scale. So let's just go through it here. I feel that my life has meaning. Even when things are bad, I still have hope. My work drains my energy. Clearly, this is going to be one of the negative responses, right? We have to do that when we develop scales. Otherwise, people will just go down and go, agree, 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 agree. So you're going to find that when you do these scales, some of the questions are going to be positive and some are going to be stated in the negative. So I feel like my life is worthwhile. We're back in the positive here now. It feels good to set goals for myself. I feel that there are things in the future to be hopeful for. I get enjoyment out of the things I do. I feel a curiosity about the world. So in this particular scale, there are actually only two negative questions. And the last one is the other negative question. I would like to disappear or become invisible. So, what you get to do as you read this scale is you get to decide, do you feel like this is a good representation of measuring whether or not someone has purpose in their life? And if it's not a good measurement, then you have to find a different scale, which is really hard to do because there's exactly one purpose in life scale. Whereas there are 12 depression scales, there are 10 anxiety scales. We have a lot of scales that measure negative things, but we don't have a lot of scales for measuring things that are good about how we feel. We don't have optimization scales or transformation scales or purpose in life scales. We have the negative scales. So it's hard to find these things. Now, the conclusion that this study had was that it would be advisable to include meaning in life in psychotherapeutic interventions with women with diagnosed with eating disorders. That's pretty good advice. That tells me that there's probably a gap here because they're suggesting that this should be included, meaning it's not included yet. So, what we've just done is we've discovered that learning the landscape is critical to starting any research project, and that the PICO is a useful tool for finding and remembering studies. Okay, let's move on into types of studies. And what I'm talking about here in particular are study designs. So as we're thinking about how might we study this, we first decide whether or not we are going to do an experimental study, in which case we'd probably use a randomized controlled trial, although there are a couple of other experimental study designs, or an observational study. And our observational studies come in several different flavors. We have a cohort or longitudinal study. We've got case control, cross-sectional, and then there are ecological studies that can be done. Because because I can't do a study where I'm going to cause an eating disorder in someone, often observational studies are the way that people go. So let's start with what are observational studies? A cohort study is when you take one group that's exposed to something and you follow them into the future and you look at who develops an outcome and who doesn't develop an outcome. You do the same thing with a group that wasn't exposed to something. So let's give an example for how we would do this with life purpose with women with eating disorders, considering we just saw a study in women with eating disorders. Okay, so we would start with our group, which is women, and we might divide them into women who have life purpose versus women with no life purpose. How would we test them for life purpose? We'd use that purpose and life scale. And so we would test women today on whether or not they have life purpose. And then we would follow them into the future to see who develops an eating disorder. Oh, I spelled that wrong, an eating disorder. So following women with life purpose, how many people developed an eating disorder and how many did not develop an eating disorder. Following women without life purpose, who develops an eating disorder, who does not develop an eating disorder. Now, there are some issues with this study design. I want you to just close your eyes and think, like, what could the issues with this study design be? First of all, life purpose may change over time. Someone who has life purpose today might not have life purpose in 6 months. Maybe their life purpose is related to their job and maybe they lose their job. Or maybe their life purpose is related to taking care of their family and their kids move out of the house and go to college or go get a job. So if life purpose changes over time, following people into the future is problematic. Furthermore, let's look at what the previous study showed. It showed that life purpose decreases with age, but doesn't pinpoint a time when an eating disorder might show up. So as we go over time, how long are we going? Are we going 6 months? Are we going 2 years, 10 years? Cohort studies typically last 10 years or longer. So if we go out 10 years, that might put somebody into a different age category, which might mean that their life purpose may decrease with their age. And then it's hard to make that correlation. Also, women with life purpose may have other health behaviors that impact whether or not they develop an eating disorder. And so it may not actually be the life purpose that is preventing an eating disorder. It may be something else entirely. Maybe their purpose in life is they're a Peloton coach and they don't have an eating disorder because they're with a group of individuals who are all so focused on health that they don't get the same exposure to other things. Okay, well, let's see if we can find another study design that might fit better. So let's talk about observational studies. Observational studies include something called a case control study. In this case, we're looking retrospectively. So we start with our cases and then we look backwards and see who was exposed to something, who was unexposed. um, among our cases and among our controls. I think the classic example of this is looking at women with breast cancer and then saying who lived under power lines and who did not live under power lines. And you discover that the women who live under power lines have a much higher incidence of breast cancer than those who don't. But how can we do this with eating disorders? So, retrospectively, we would start with looking at people who have eating disorders and people who don't have eating disorders. And then we would say, in the past, did you have life purpose or did you not have life purpose? Hmm, what are the issues with this study design? Are you filling in the blanks for me? Okay, here's what I came up with. Again, life purpose might not be stable over time. And so if you go back and say, well, tell me if you had life purpose in the past, well, maybe you did one year and you didn't the next year. So it's really hard to retrospectively ask people about their life purpose. That's challenging. We're asking people to remember whether they had life purpose. I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday. And because this isn't randomized, again, there may be other behaviors that are associated with each group. Randomization is what really takes care of this idea that there might be other things that you're exposed to. Okay, observational studies. These tend to be cross-sectional studies, and cross-sectional studies is different from our other two observational studies, the cohort and the case control, because you're looking at a single point in time. So at a single point in time, you take a population of people and then you gather data on whether they've been exposed to things, and then you look at who has or does not have the disease. So how would we look at this with respect to eating disorders and life purpose? We've got three potential possibilities here. You could have a random selection of women, and then you could measure their life purpose and measure their eating habits and see if there's a correlation with those who have life purpose and how they eat. A second potential design is select women who have eating disorders and then measure their life purpose and measure their hopelessness. This is what was done in that previous study that we looked at. They selected women with eating disorders, they measured their life purpose, they measured their hopelessness, and then they correlated that with age. A third potential design would be to select women without life purpose and then measure their eating habits and measure their hopelessness. And again, look for the correlation. So crossover designs can be done pretty easily. Are they more accurate than the cohort or the case control? In this particular situation, they may be. We can also do secondary data analysis. In secondary data analysis, you're not collecting any of your own data. Often large studies, either clinical studies or epidemiological studies, generate a lot of data, and researchers answer one or two questions and then they just discard the rest of the data. So you as a researcher can go into these data sets and answer research questions. And then we have randomized controlled trials. So here is a randomized controlled trial design. This is just one example where you could recruit people with eating disorders, assess their life purpose, and then do an intervention, a life purpose intervention, or no intervention. And then afterwards, assess life purpose and see whether or not they still have an eating disorder. Now, this predicates the idea that you can actually live, get rid of an eating disorder. You know, like we say with alcoholics, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. This might not be our best outcome measure. Moreover, is it ethical to provide no treatment? That's one of those questions that's hard to answer. Um, so maybe we need a different design. What if we recruit people with life purpose and then we remove their life purpose versus give no intervention? And then we look at eating disorders. Is that ethical? Is it ethical to remove life purpose? Is it ethical to try to cause an eating disorder? I don't think it is. I personally don't think it is. But this idea of removing life purpose, there are several examples of people who have their life purpose removed who have to find new ones. So the most commonly studied group is people who retire from the military. And when they retire from the military, often what we see happen is they have associated defending democracy with their life purpose. And now they are done with the military and you have just removed their life purpose. Are they going to go on to develop an eating disorder? They may. Many go on to develop alcoholism. They develop many other health issues. They become suicidal. So, this idea of removing life purpose, we don't have to do it. It is done to people all the time. I also think about farmers in the Midwest. And as the large conglomerate farms came in, all the individual farms went under and we removed people's life purpose. And we saw an enormous increase in drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and suicidality. Nobody measured eating disorders, but there's a ton of data on those people. So that could be a secondary data analysis project. Because unless you have a very different ethical and values sentiment than it is not ethical to try to cause an eating disorder. But there are plenty of things that exist in real life that remove life purpose. Another study design that is similar to an RCT is called a quasi-experimental design. And in this case, you recruit participants, you measure their outcome, then you treat them, and then you measure the outcome again. The issue here is, what is the treatment for finding meaning in life? That's a hard question to answer, as it turns out. As they were doing this with veterans, they said, well, whose job is it to actually ask people about their meaning in life? Is it a physician? Nope, not their job. Is it a pastor or someone in the religious field? Maybe, maybe. What they ultimately came up with are support groups that people actually will discuss life meaning with peers before they will discuss it with a pastor or a reverend, before they'll discuss it with a physician. They're not trained to discuss life purpose anyway, even if they're a psychologist. So, this idea that there's a treatment is a little bit more complicated than we might think. So quasi-experimental, we're thinking about participants used as their own control, and we do a pre-post analysis. We have to have a really good idea of what our treatment is here. Now, I'm not saying that the treatment has to be the same for everyone. In a classical RCT, you would treat everyone with exactly the same thing. But in a quasi-experimental design, you can tailor it a little bit to the person. When you do that, we have what's called whole systems research. In whole systems research, we recruit our participants, we allow them to get treated however they are going to be treated, whether that's by a clinician or a support group or a pastor, whoever, and we document what they do, and then we measure all of the relevant outcomes. So whole systems research is designed to actually look at a whole person. Now, are we really looking at a whole person? Are we measuring everything we can measure from that person? No, we're measuring a subset of outcomes, but it's better than measuring one outcome because you might miss the relevant outcome if you're only measuring one thing. In addition to these other types of research, there's qualitative research, and qualitative research is often overlooked. But doing focus groups and interviews gives you a richness of data that you don't often get from your average randomized controlled trial with a purpose and life scale. So the benefit of qualitative data is it allows you to ask questions that cannot be easily put into numbers to understand the human experience. And who can you ask? Well, you can ask patients, you can ask experts in the field, or you can ask unattached observers. Really, there's no limit to who you can ask. But what you have to remember is that the question that you want to answer is leading you to your study design. So, Tracy Gaudette's discovery with veterans came up with this quote: we're starting from the wrong place. To change the outcomes of the system, we need to change the conversation. We need to start with discovering what gives each of us a sense of meaning and purpose, what matters most deeply in our lives. That's going to get us to this place where we can make a difference in someone's life. So here's where we are so far. Different designs allow us to ask different questions that could all be related to the same topic. If our health outcomes are related to life purpose, perhaps we should be asking different questions to our patients. I'm reading this fantastic book right now. It's called Moral Ambition. And I opened the book, and this is the quote on the first page of the prologue. And I thought it fit really well. I cannot believe that the purpose of life is to be happy. I think that the purpose of life is to be useful, to be responsible, to be honorable, to be compassionate. It is above all to matter, to count, to stand for something, and to have it make some difference that you lived at all. And for those of you that were just present for Nancy's talk, that's exactly what she just said. That when people are starting to go into an eating disordered pattern, often that they're feeling like they don't make a difference, that no one can see them. And so this idea that we need to matter is important. So how do people develop self-purpose? Well, some people do it with religion and spirituality. Other people do it with their job or their career. Some people do it taking care of others, whether that's parents or children or someone that's not related to them. But the idea of taking care of someone else gives them purpose. That could also be a pet, by the way. And we've seen a huge increase in the number of people getting pets so that they have someone to take care of. For some people, it's working on a movement. And we probably need more of those people these days. And then for others, it's giving to others. And that gratitude that comes back gives them a sense of purpose. Now let's look at binge eating disorder. How are people treating binge eating disorder? Is it those things that to develop life purpose? Cognitive behavioral therapy? Nope. Counseling? Nope. SSRIs and lisdexamfetamine? Definitely nope. Support groups and 12-step programs. This might be giving to others. This might be some bonding and some caretaking. Nutritional counseling. Most people who have eating disorders have a pretty good idea of what they should and should not be eating, but there is some nutritional counseling that could happen here, as we've talked about with looking for hidden sweeteners and hidden sources of things that are going to make us addicted. There's a new therapy that's out, relatively new, it's about 2 years old, deep brain stimulation. Now, this is fascinating to me because it's something that's used for Parkinson's, which is a group that I study. And the idea here is that you can do deep brain stimulation and change the addictive behavior by disrupting the signaling that's happening there. Certainly, that would be treating the cause, but it's not treating the cause of life purpose, it's treating the cause of addiction. The idea here is that they're starting to do deep brain stimulation for all sorts of addiction, but especially for binge eating disorder. So, interesting idea. But one of the things that says to me, both the CBT and the deep brain stimulation, is we got to change our state of consciousness. And that again is something that you've heard before, because I've heard other speakers say it. So how do we change our state of consciousness? And this takes us to this idea of, could we use a psychedelic? I know you've already heard from Dr. Mac Hicks. I know you're hearing from Peyton Folestad tomorrow. I am both of their mentors. And so I thought we should just talk for a moment about eating disorders and psychedelics. Why should we consider a psychedelic for a binge eating disorder? Well, first of all, psychedelics can help people connect to spirit. And one of the things that Peyton's going to demonstrate tomorrow is that ayahuasca actually helps people connect to spirit. But it's not just ayahuasca. I've had other students do studies on psilocybin and show that psilocybin helps people find God, find their connection to spirit, and often develop a sense of life purpose as a result of that. They can finally see the links between them and humanity. So, if that's the case, that alone might be a good case for using a psychedelic for an eating disorder. The second thing is that psychedelics can function like an SSRI. So, for example, psilocybin is known to bind to serotonin receptor 2A. And we know that the serotonin receptors help with anxiety, right? Now, what's interesting with serotonin in particular is that there's 15 different serotonin receptors. And so, what that means is that your brain is going to respond to different concentrations of serotonin in different ways. If you get too much serotonin, you actually get that feeling of butterflies in your stomach and you start to feel nervous and anxious. So dosage is important, is what I'm saying here. And I think people who do cannabis, it's better reported, but some people will have an anxiety reaction. Same thing is true with mushrooms, that people can have a high dose of mushrooms and become more anxious rather than less anxious. So psilocybin is binding to that serotonin 2A receptor, but you want to hit the right dose in order to reduce the anxiety and change the consciousness experience. Psychedelics stimulate the brain. So maybe they're going to react similarly to DBS, to deep brain stimulation. Nobody knows. Nobody studied this. Here's a gap in the literature. Let's all go do some studies on psychedelics and deep brain stimulation and see what the similarities or differences are. Psychedelics are often done in ceremony with others. And so that idea of a support group can actually be met with psychedelics. If you think about how people do ayahuasca, or you think about Dr. Hicks' study of veterans, they were doing psilocybin in group therapy. And this is not an unusual thing. If you look historically at how psychedelics were used, they were often used when a shaman would decide that different members of a tribe were ready for a shift in consciousness. And he would get those members, usually it was a he, in some societies, a she, they would get those members together and they would do a ceremony to raise consciousness. And if you read the literature on this, a lot of times those ceremonies bonded people together. In fact, in the ayahuasca ceremony literature, they talk about people developing psychic connections with each other after having these ceremonies. So, and during ceremonies. So, I have a friend who has done ayahuasca many times, but she talks about the time that she did ayahuasca, her very first time in Peru. And she, who at that point was a 60-year-old woman, was having a psychic conversation with a 16-year-old Peruvian male across the group from her. She didn't speak Spanish, but through this ceremony, they connected with each other. And afterwards, they both came together and they had experienced the same thing, but they were unable to talk about it without a translator. So they had this connection that defied language. And I think that's really interesting. Finally, psychedelics can change consciousness to allow someone to discover their sense of purpose. So, as we think about sense of life purpose, could you use psychedelics to develop that sense of purpose as a therapeutic approach? And I think the answer is yes. So here would be the design. We would recruit people with eating disorders. We might give them a psychedelic such as psilocybin, and that would be compared with no intervention or standard of care. And then we would look at life purpose as the outcome. There's so many different directions to go, and there are so many gaps in the literature that we could really recruit all of you to be researchers in this area. So that's where I am going to stop. And I want to give special thanks to Dr. Brenna Bray for the invitation to speak today. Again, I always have to give the grants that I'm funded on. And with that, I will take questions if there are any.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Do
Think, are
we
you ready
have?
to do a study?
Yeah, I am. I think Heather Campbell, I saw putting her hand up. Did you have a question, Heather?
It's so funny. I don't know how to do that. I only know how to do
Oh,
that real put
yeah.
up a hand.
It
Um,
worked.
I don't have a specific question. I just wanted to say thank you.
You're
I
welcome.
think bringing life's purpose and talking about that is so critically important. In looking at that element that is so critical to every human being. Um, and
And it's
so
something that we
often just
ignore. Yeah.
it's frightening how that is not. When you think about, again, in so many different studies, so I'm just reading the book Abundance. Have you read
Mm.
it?
No, it's on my list though.
I'm I'm both so sad and so excited by it.
Mhm.
There's a lot about studies. I mean, there's a lot about the NIH. There's a lot about studies. I'd highly recommend it for this group. Um, I don't know that I've read anything about life's purpose in it yet, though. I'm not completely done. So anyway, I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. It's super interesting because that's what I find in a lot of the books I read. It's like they come right up to it and stop.
Mhm.
And that's why this book, Moral Ambition, is actually really interesting to me, um, because he talks about the fact that so many people who are in dead-end jobs or who feel like their job doesn't matter often then relate that to their own self-worth, that they don't matter. And there's a great example that he gives that is like, at what point do you say, I'm just going to stop this and I'm going to do something else that matters?
Mm,
There's only one program I know of, and it's at Stanford, that they do with kids to actually teach them life purpose. And they do it with kids that are typically sixth grade to eighth graders, so middle schoolers. It's 12 days. And in 12 days, they get these kids to start defining their own life purpose.
mm.
If it's
That's,
that easy to do, shouldn't we do it with everybody?
yeah.
Yeah.
I've gone in when my kids were in middle school, I went to their school for career day. And I'm, listening to all of these parents wonderfully, opening up their eyes. You could do this, you could do this. I got up and I presented about all of the jobs I quit
Yeah.
and why I quit them, and how knowing that I was an adult and I would need to put a roof over my head, food in my belly, and have health insurance, that those were requirements. But I get to decide what kind of roof, what kind of food, and again, you need insurance. Um, and the eyes opening up. I had one little boy raise his hand. Could I be a potter? Could I do pottery? I don't know. You
Yeah.
might. But I have to say, I felt like I was taking a risk by talking to middle schoolers about you get to quit and you get to decide.
But why is that the case? I mean, again, I don't know if this is a result of capitalism, but this idea that we, want to encourage children
Right.
to become the best versions of themselves,
Mhm.
and yet we never talk about purpose in
Correct.
that conversation. I mean, it's like we're missing the boat.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. With the group at Stanford, they actually take them into nature. And taking them into nature is part of the piece of helping them discover what their life purpose is, because they feel like they need to get them out of society in order to figure that out.
My oldest has just changed their major for the third time. They're about to become a sophomore. And their major is now environmental design because they realized they want to be outside.
Yeah. Yeah. Good for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm, beautiful. Um, yeah, I'll just add a little to the conversation of just kind of like themes that have been touched on throughout the day today. That spiritual connection is a big one. So Nancy talked about that in kind of 12-step facilitation. PJ Gunter shared on racism and marginalization in finance. And there's a question kind of like, how do you hold these hard things with joy? And she kind of accredited meditation and access to higher power. Um, which I think is kind of beautiful. And then that piece of connection, that was one thing that Matthew Hicks shared that really stood out to me was that, in their group psilocybin assisted therapy study, they found folks reported greater connection to one another and less barriers to interact with others socially, which, my work and many others have shown interpersonal relating as is kind of a very high factor, environmental factor in binge eating disorder.
We see that with people who haven't identified with binge eating disorder, but who have metabolic syndrome. And we've
Mhm.
done clinical trials, nutritional studies with these folks. And what we find is if they have a group cooking experience, they immediately bond with the other people in that experience. And we had a 10-week intervention. At the end of the intervention, the people in the study continued to cook together for another 6 months because it was that important to them. So I feel like that piece of connection and social support is so huge. And again, often not recognized.
Mm, beautiful. Thank you. Well, I see that Neris is on. Let me just really quick check the Facebook chat comments. Okay, no questions. They're all saying thumbs up, thank you, hearts, emojis. Lots of emojis.
My
Um,
dogs are going crazy. So I'm going to
yeah,
take myself on mute and I'm going to let
beautiful.
you take over.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.